Hello and welcome to another episode of Agency Leadership Live. It's Friday. We're almost at the weekend, but before we get to the weekend, what do we have? We have open Q&A, live Q&A, where you get to ask your questions. I'll answer them about pretty much anything, but really if we can focus on the business of PR and marketing agencies, that's probably better for all of us. So let's go ahead and get into the show. So it is Friday. I'm Chip Griffin. I'm hoping you're having a great week and are looking forward to the weekend. Here in New Hampshire, we've got a bit of warming weather, which I guess is nice, although I'm personally a fan of the fall, so the sooner I can get into a sweater, that's the better. In fact, I have to leave my windows open here in my home studio to give a little bit of fresh air in here so that I don't just get inundated with heat with all this electronics around me. So if you hear the birds chirping in the background, that's why. But you didn't come to hear the birds chirp, and you didn't come here to hear me talking about the birds chirping. Instead, you came to talk about issues related to the business of running your PR or marketing agency. And I've got some questions from the mailbag, but if you have your own questions, please share them in the comments or the chat on whatever platform you're watching me on, and I will try to answer them here live this afternoon. If you've got questions that you'd like to submit for future shows, you can always send me an email, chip@agencyleadership.com, or use the Ask Chip functionality on the Agency Leadership website. And of course, if you would like to get access to all of our previous shows and all of the questions that have been answered and a variety of topics, interviews, all that kind of stuff, just go to agencyleadership.tv for the complete archive. So, with that, we will start with the mailbag as we usually do while I wait for some questions to come in. Go ahead and ask your questions, say hello, whatever you want in the chat, share your feedback, be snarky. I don't know, I'm kind of in a feisty mood because it's Friday, so let's go on. All right, I gave a prospect a quote a couple of months ago, but then they ghosted me. I just got a call back and they said they want to start, but I have recently changed my minimum project requirement. What should I do? So this is something that has happened to many of us, I'm sure. We have given a proposal or a quote to a client, a prospect. They then wait quite a while, come back and say, yes, I'd like to do it. And now you're like, well, do I really want to do that? You might have changed your pricing. You might have changed the kind of project work you want to do. Maybe you're busier now. There's all sorts of things that can change. I remember when I had my very first agency, one of the first pitches that I did was to a nonprofit agency that was looking to do some web design work. And so I gave them a proposal, and this was back in probably 1999. I gave them a proposal and followed up, and they said, yeah, we want to do it, but we're just, timing's not right. And so after a couple of months, I realized they were just ghosting me. I gave up. Almost a year after I had given the original proposal, I got a phone call, and they said, we'd like to go ahead and take on that work that you proposed. Now, this was back in the days when we used floppy disk, 3.5-inch disks to store proposals and that kind of thing. And to be honest with you, I couldn't find the proposal. So I was in a position where I actually had to ask the prospect to fax the proposal back to me so I knew what I had promised I could do and how much I had promised it for. Fortunately, they were understanding because they had taken so long, but it was a bit embarrassing. Obviously, these days, much easier with larger storage devices in the cloud and all that kind of stuff. So I can find pretty much any proposal I've put out in the last few years for anything, and it takes just a matter of seconds to do. So what do you do? What happens when that occurs? In my case, I took the work. It was not necessarily the same pricing that I would have given if I was working on the same project then. After all, when I first proposed it, I was in the first few months of running my own business, and a year in, I developed more confidence, and with more confidence typically comes higher prices. But I accepted the work for a variety of reasons, relationships, those kinds of things, and just because I sort of felt like it was the right thing to do at the time. But you may not be in that same situation. You may be sitting there saying, well, this work just doesn't fit with where I want to be going. And there does come a time where it's okay to walk back your original proposal or your whatever work that you had planned to do. Certainly in my case, a year, that's plenty sufficient to say that things have changed in that time period. In this particular example, it's only been a couple of months, according to the questioner. A couple of months is probably a bit short to say you've changed your whole model. You don't you're not obligated to do it, right? This is not, they don't have a contract that they've signed or an agreement like that. So you certainly can walk it back. The key things for you to think about in these cases are, what does it mean for your reputation? Is it work that you want to be doing but maybe just doesn't fit within your pricing minimum? Is there a way that you can address that? Can you indicate to the client that you've changed your business model, but because you're so excited about working with them, you're willing to make an exception? So you need to think these things through, and there's no clear-cut answer. It's not like at the 3-month mark or the 4-month mark it all of a sudden becomes magic and you can walk away with no issues. You really need to judge what your existing relationship was with that prospect. You want to judge where you want that relationship to go. Who do they know that you might be pitching? Because all of these things go to your overall reputation and the strength of the impression that you're creating. At the same time, if you've made a clear-cut decision that you're not going to take on certain kinds of projects because they're too small, because they're outside your area of expertise, in those cases, even if it's a shorter period of time, it's probably better to walk away if you can, because you don't want to be doing work that you don't feel like you should be doing or don't feel like you could be doing as well as you would like to. And so in those cases, it's really important to find an alternative. So anytime that you've given a proposal and for some reason you need to walk it back, it could just be your availability, right? I mean, other major work could have come in the time, and so maybe what you say is, I can't take that work on now. It's going to be a few weeks or even a couple of months before I have the bandwidth to take it. But have an alternative. If you're giving that prospect some bad news, think about who you could refer them to in your network. Think about whether you might take the work on and just subcontract it out anyway, so that you're not really doing the work, but you're just interfacing with the client. Now, there are risks with that. We've talked about that on shows previously, the challenge of managing subcontractors, because your reputation is on the line, but you have less control than you do with employees or even freelancers. So think those things through as you're making the decision. But the bottom line is that you do have some flexibility to walk it back if you think you want to go in a different direction, but you really do need to be thoughtful about what it's going to do to the relationship. And the more time has passed, I think the more flexibility you have, the less time that's passed, the more likely you should lean towards taking on the work at the proposed price in the proposed scope. So hopefully that helps on that question. Let's go ahead, and I see you all watching here, so it shows me that you're watching. I can't see who you are, but do say hello or ask a question if you've got one, because it's always great to be interactive here. All right, the next question I have is, what should I include in the onboarding process for new clients? And this is a question I got in a phone call this week, and so there was a lot more information to it, but I want to just sort of look at a little bit more of the macro level of the onboarding process generally. So when you've got a new client for your agency, there are a number of different ways that prospect may have become a client. And so some of that is going to govern how your onboarding process goes. In this particular case, it was an agency that has the sales function separate from the client service function. So they have an actual sales team that brings the clients on board, and they do consultative sales. So they've got members of the sales team who are communicators in their own right, but they're not the ones doing the day-to-day service. And they make that clear to the prospects. So, and that's the first thing. If you're going to have that kind of setup, which is, I'd say it's more common for large volume agencies, particularly digital design shops, those kinds of things, to have a separate sales team. If you're more on the PR side, typically there's less of that. It's probably the owner doing most of the sales, maybe a few executives, but oftentimes those individuals are also doing client service. But if you have that bright line distinction between the two departments, there's a few things that you need to be thinking about from an onboarding perspective. You need to look at this as this is the opportunity to make the introduction to the client service team, and it's an opportunity, it's really a necessity to take the goodwill that the sales team built and transfer it over to the people who are going to be doing the day-to-day client service. And I will say that in general, even when you've got the two separate components, I prefer to see the prospect get to meet whoever's going to be handling client service before they sign the contract. I think it's valuable for that relationship to have already begun for a number of reasons. Because even if you're clear and saying this is not a bait and switch, I am the salesperson, you will be working with a client service team. Even if you've made that clear, it's not quite the same as actually getting to see the individual. But you also have the internal thing, which is if you have one group of people who are doing the selling and another group of people who are doing the actual work, you have to make sure that they are on the same page, because oftentimes salespeople are inclined to agree to almost anything to get the signature on the contract, and it's oftentimes that they will promise things that are not impossible for the client service team to do, but maybe it's a bigger lift. Maybe it takes them more time, so maybe that impacts profit margins. And ultimately, the sales team usually isn't held responsible for the profit margin on the client service work. It's the client service team. So you want to make sure that at a minimum, there's behind-the-scenes communication, that they're on the same page, so that you've got your client service and salespeople in agreement on what's being proposed and the pricing and all that kind of stuff, so that you don't end up with any internal surprises. But it's also valuable for the prospect to see that and know that, so that the first time they meet the client service team isn't after they have signed the contract and hop onto that first onboarding call. But now that we've sort of addressed that situation where you've got the two separate ones, we now get to where there's commonality. So regardless of whether you have that situation where you're doing a handoff as part of the onboarding process, or whether the people who are doing the sales are also part of the onboarding process, you want to make absolutely sure in the onboarding process that you've got a clear set of expectations. Again, some of this will start before the sale is actually closed. It comes down to making sure that you're clear with the prospect. What is the timeline for action? What can they expect once they sign the contract for how quickly things will move? What are the things that you need from them? What are the questions that you're going to be asking? You don't want there to be surprises, because a lot of times clients will come into an agency and expect immediate results. And the reality is, as we all know, it takes time. Your team needs to get up to speed on that client. Oftentimes you need to get information from them. You need to set processes in place. There are all sorts of things that you need to do that are unique to whatever service you're delivering and the way that you're delivering it. And in order for that to work effectively, I like to provide an actual timeline for the client during the onboarding process that says things like, week 1 we do this, week 2 we do this. It may be days. It could be based on number of days from the last step. So when I was building websites, I often would use that sort of mechanism. So I would put in, this is what happens in the first week, the second week, and then after that, it's all keyed to reaching approvals for the mock-ups and the final design and the content and things like that. So it would be framed after those first few weeks where it's really a known quantity for the most part in the kinds of work that I was doing at the time. And at that point, I'll say 10 days after this, we'll get you that. 15 days later, we'll get you this, right? So that gives you a number of different opportunities to set expectations correctly with the client, but it also helps them understand the role that they have in keeping the project on track, because none of us can run an agency effectively and keep on track and on time if we're not getting the kinds of feedback that we need from clients. And I think on last week's show, or maybe the week before, we talked about indecisive clients who are not giving you the feedback that you need and how to address that. And it really does start during this onboarding process. The other thing that you want to make clear during the onboarding process is who the client should go to when they have an emergency or a question or those kinds of things. And I like providing very clear contacts for the client. So whether that's a document, a spreadsheet, access on whatever project management system that you're sharing with the client, but somewhere they need to have ready access to emails and phone numbers for the critical contacts in your agency. And it should include not just the folks who are doing their day-to-day, but who can they escalate to. You never want to leave a client in a position where they're wondering, who they should bring a concern to. They should always know that, and you want to direct the path. I'm also a big fan for small agencies, which is most of you out there who are listening to me today. If you're an agency of 25, 50 employees or fewer, I love the idea of giving out your personal cell phone number as the owner to all of your clients. And this is something that I would do in a number of my businesses. I have to tell you, in the course of 20 plus years of running my own businesses and doing this, can probably think on one hand, maybe one or two times over the course of that someone has abused that privilege. It doesn't happen. Typically, if they're reaching out to me, there's a good reason for it. Now, if you find that you're small enough and perhaps you were involved in the sale, they're coming in and they're asking you for everything on a day-to-day basis, well, then you need to make sure that you're directing them correctly so that they get the speedier service for the day-to-day items. And so oftentimes what I would do then is, if I was getting emailed, for example, I would forward it to the account manager and have them respond to the client. Copy me, but just make clear that the account manager is the one driving it. And that sort of handoff can be really valuable when you've been part of the sales process, and during the onboarding you want to make sure that they understand who it is that they're going to be talking to on a daily basis. So that's why these kinds of contact lists, and particularly explaining what the role is of each individual and who they should reach out to, can be valuable. In the onboarding, you also want to set a meeting cadence, and I think it's very important to have regular meetings with your clients. Even if you're doing project work where you say, it's fluid, we're not sure, I still like getting weekly or semi-monthly calls on the books with clients, just to make sure that you have a regular routine of checking in, because that's an opportunity for the client to share any concerns, ask any questions in a forum where you're likely to get the unvarnished truth or the less varnished truth that will help you serve the client better, but also will help you build the long-term relationship. So use the onboarding process to figure out what that right frequency is. And you may change that frequency over time, but at least get something on the books there. And then finally, I think the onboarding process is a really important place to reset or reconfirm, really, the expectations that you have on how the success of the project is going to be measured. Hopefully there's something in the conversations you had pre-sale that goes into this, but regardless, you want to make sure that when you're working with the client during that onboarding process, that you know what are the things that they're going to be looking at to know that the work with your agency has been successful. Is it an uplift in sales? Is it an increase in web traffic? Is it reputational in nature? How are they going to assess it? And I would address this first in qualitative terms, but then also try to drill down into quantitative things that you can actually put into place in a measurement program, whether that's looking at things like media coverage, social media, web traffic, internal sales tools, whatever. But the more that you can reinforce this during the onboarding process, the better off you are, particularly because onboarding typically involves more people on both the client and the agency side than were involved in the sales process. So even if the folks who were involved in making the sale have that meeting of the minds, you want to make sure that you've re-engaged that meeting of the minds during that onboarding process, so that the full teams on both sides who are working on it know how they're going to be judged, and there won't be any surprises 6 or 12 months down the road, or at least there's less chance of there being surprises 6 or 12 months down the road. So all right, so that, I think, covers that onboarding question. I'd be curious if you're listening either live or after the fact, why don't you share any tips that you might have for things that have worked in onboarding, or red flags that you want to look out for based on your own experience. I think we can share lots with each other on the onboarding process, and it's probably worth a separate show in and of itself. All right. The last question I have from the mailbag here today, but there's still time to ask a question or two if you want from the chat, so go ahead and do that while I'm answering this one if you'd like. And this one is one that came in via email. A prospect is struggling to afford my agency and asked for a payment plan. I want to work with them, but I'm worried if this is a good idea. So, payment plans. So, a lot of agency clients are forcing agencies increasingly into the role of being a banker. This is something that even the largest companies who have really no major cash flow issues, at least not that would affect contracts the size of what most of their agencies are getting paid, they are using agencies as a bank. They are putting the burden on the agency to incur expenses in the form of salaries and even sometimes out-of-pocket expenses in advance of being paid. Now, that's not specifically what this question goes to, but the reason why I bring this up is because agencies are not banks. You are not a bank. you should not be lending money in any way, shape, or form to your clients. Now, that doesn't mean that you can always get paid in advance or paid on the immediate timeline that you want from clients. There are always going to be situations where you're going to have to offer some kind of payment terms to the client. And typically on projects, it may be in the form of getting paid percentages at different milestones or different dates. In the case of retainer work, oftentimes when you're working particularly with larger clients or government clients in particular can be a challenge here in that they're often prohibited from paying in advance. Now with private companies, you can sometimes push back on that. With some of the government entities, it may be written into the actual regulations that prohibits it, so you could have more challenges there. But either way, there are going to be cases where you cannot get paid exactly the way you want and when you want. But it's your obligation to yourself, your business, your employees, to make sure that you're getting paid as timely as possible. And so if you've got a client who's coming to you and saying, we'd like to extend payment terms, that's a very difficult thing for you to do because you're putting out all of the money to pay everyone that needs to be there to do the work. And so if you are in a position where you're going to extend payment terms in some fashion, there has to be some real benefit to you. And that benefit is not that you've got the client, it's not that you can count the revenue on your books, it's not that you've got some logo that you can put in your presentation. You need to think through what's the actual tangible value of offering a concession to an individual client. Just as I've said, when you take a pay cut from a client, you need to be willing to ask for something in return, either in the form of reducing your service load or getting them to do a public endorsement or something. You need something for those discounts. Excuse me, you need a sip of water here. You need to do the same thing when it comes to payment plans. Don't ever just give someone some sort of a payment plan because they've asked for it, even though you know they may need it. You need to think through what's in it for you. How are you going to make this work for you and not just turn you into that low interest or no interest bank. And so the other thing that you need to think about when you are doing this is you need to think about whether the client is going to continuously have problems paying, because that's something you consider and it may be something you want to walk away from. You may also want to think about the fact that if you've got a client who is having difficulty paying, it may not be the right kind of client for you. And so let me explain that. There's a lot of talk about the Goldilocks principle as far as pricing, so that you offer one package that's too high, one that's too low, and they'll pick the one in the middle because it's just right. When you're working with finding clients for your agency, it's important to think about how you bring on clients who are the right size for you. And so I'm a big believer in a Goldilocks principle from that perspective. If you've got a client who is so big that the amount of money they're paying your agency is inconsequential, particularly for whatever group within that business is hiring you or that organization is hiring you, that may not be a good one because they may not be invested in the relationship in the same way you are. Ideally, when you have an agency-client relationship, you want to make sure that there is investment in the outcome from both sides because, as I talked about earlier during the onboarding question, you need to have help from the client in order to be successful. If they view the work that you're doing as inconsequential and they recognize that by how little they're paying, that's a problem. At the same time, if you've got a client like this who is struggling to come up with the money to pay you, the question is why? And if it's because the amount of money that your agency charges is so substantial to this client that it's make or break, that's often not the kind of work that you want to take on either. The reason why you don't want to take that on is because those are the clients who tend to be the most difficult, because for them, they're often throwing a Hail Mary pass with the work that they're doing with your agency. They believe that whatever you're doing is going to rescue them. It's going to take them immediately to that next level. It's going to help them solve whatever their challenge is quickly. And during the sales process, both sides have a lot of excitement over that being a possibility. If you sense that that's the case with a client, you at the very least need to make sure that they understand that there are no guarantees, that it does take time to get things done and achieve results. And you're not going to help them turn around their business or their sales or whatever it is that they're looking for quickly. Doesn't mean you can't, and maybe you will, but don't promise them that, because now they're investing so much in it that the likelihood of it failing is very high, because they're going to have sky-high expectations for what can be accomplished. The other problem here is that those are the clients who will tend to nitpick everything. Because think about it, if you've, in your personal life, if you've made an investment in, let's say building a house, okay? If you're building a house, and that is in all likelihood the biggest investment you've ever made, that's something where you're going to be working with the home builder and really looking at all of the little details and questioning all of the things that they're doing. They're used to that. That's how they run their business. In your agency, that's probably not how you're used to doing it, because you're used to working with clients who have more reasonable expectations. They're hiring your agency to do something, but the folks who are working with you on a day-to-day basis have other things to do. And so that modulates that interaction a little bit so that they're really focused on the important things with you and not every little detail. If you've got someone who's scrounged together their pennies in order to afford to hire your agency, they're likely to be questioning every decision, every expense, it's going to be very difficult. So I would rather you look for clients that can comfortably afford you, and that's how you're likely to end up with a better client base. Doesn't mean that there aren't cases where you may need to look at things like installments or payment plans, but again, I wouldn't use it necessarily as an affordability thing. I would look at it more in the terms of a risk mitigation device. So we all know that one of the biggest holdups to a client signing on with an agency is concern about the risk of whether they're going to actually get the results that are promised. And so sometimes you can use installment plans, payment plans, guarantees, all those kinds of things in order to allay risk. But if it's simply to make somebody be able to afford you, that's where I have concerns. And so I would urge you to be reluctant to engage in those kinds of negotiations, because it's unlikely to work out the way that you would like to see it. So with that brings to an end another episode of Agency Leadership Live. As I said before, you can access the complete archive at agencyleadership.tv. You can see these previous Friday episodes. I'm here every Friday live, noon Eastern Time, taking your questions. Again, send them by email, chip@agencyleadership.com. Use the Ask Chip functionality on the agencyleadership.com website. Send up a smoke signal, come in and ask your question live, however you would like to do it. I would love to hear from you. And as always, I love to get your feedback as well, to know where you think I hit the mark and where I may have gone astray. So with that, we will bring this to a close. I have a great weekend. I hope you get outside and enjoy yourself for a little bit, get a little bit of rest, and come back firing on all cylinders next week.